The screams echoed through the tunnels beneath the Colosseum, as 5,000 wild animals and 3,000 men were slaughtered in a single day, all to celebrate the opening of a building. The Emperor Titus smiled as exotic beasts from the far corners of the earth tore gladiators apart, while 50,000 spectators roared their approval. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. This wasn't considered barbaric. This was Tuesday afternoon entertainment in the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever seen. Rome didn't just conquer, they consumed. They enslaved over 2 million people, crucified entire armies, and literally salted the earth of cities that dared resist them. Yet these same Romans gave us modern plumbing, invented the hospital, created our calendar, and wrote laws that still govern our courts today. They were building skyscrapers, performing cataract surgery, and eating ice cream while most of the world was still living in caves. How does a civilization become so advanced that it seems like science fiction, yet so brutal it makes your worst nightmares look tame? How did farmers and shepherds from central Italy become lords of the known world, controlling the fate of 65 million people across 3 continents? Tonight, we uncover the blood-soaked rise and catastrophic fall of history's most contradictory empire, one that gave us everything we consider civilized while perfecting the art of organized savagery.
But before we begin, make sure to hit the subscribe button, because we're about to traverse the entire rise and fall of one of the greatest empire in human history. Beneath the soft, golden Italian skies, there flowed a river, the Tiber, quiet and winding, its waters reflecting the gentle blue above. The landscape was one of rolling hills, verdant meadows, and ancient forests where dappled sunlight filtered through leaves that whispered in the breeze. And on the banks of this river, in a cradle of woven reeds that rocked with the current, floated 2 infant boys, twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Their story begins with their mother, Rhea Silvia, a princess of Alba Longa, who served as a Vestal Virgin. She was visited, it was said, by the god Mars himself, who came to her in a dream of fire and shadow. From this divine union, she bore twin sons. But the king, Amulius, who had usurped the throne from their grandfather, feared these divine children. He ordered them cast into the Tiber to drown. Yet the river, gentle and wise, carried their basket safely to shore. There, drawn by their hungry cries, came a she-wolf, her coat silver in the moonlight, her eyes amber and knowing. She, who had lost her own cubs, took pity on these human infants. She nursed them with tenderness, cleaned them with her rough tongue, and kept them warm against the cool night air. In time, a shepherd named Faustulus found the boys. He and his wife raised Romulus and Remus as their own, teaching them the ways of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, the calling of sheep, and the reading of stars. As they grew into strong young men, they learned of their true heritage. Their blood was royal, their father divine, their destiny to found a city. Together, they overthrew the usurper king of Alba Longa, restoring their grandfather to the throne. But they dreamed of more. They wished to build a city of their own, a city unlike any other, a city that would last forever. They returned to the 7 hills by the Tiber, where the wolf had saved them. But which hill should bear their city? Romulus chose the Palatine, Remus the Aventine. They sought signs from the gods to decide. Remus saw 6 vultures, Romulus saw 12. But dreams divide even brothers. Words grew heated. Tempers flared like summer lightning. In a moment that would echo through the centuries, Romulus struck his brother down. Some say it was in anger. Others say it was the will of the gods. As Remus lay on the ground, his blood seeping into the soil that would become Rome, Romulus wept. But there was no undoing what was done. He buried his brother with honor, then turned to the task at hand. He plowed a furrow around the Palatine Hill, marking the sacred boundary of his new city. He named it after himself, Roma, Rome. It was April 21st in the year 753 BCE. Before the Republic shone like a beacon of democracy, Rome was cradled in the hands of kings. 7 kings, tradition tells us, each adding a layer to the foundation of what would become the greatest empire the world had known. Romulus ruled first, a king of warriors with eyes that could pierce a man's soul. He was both wise and brutal, visionary and ruthless. He summoned men from all corners of Italy, warriors with scars etching stories across their bodies, thieves with quick hands and quicker minds, outlaws seeking redemption, shepherds with knowledge of the land written in their weathered faces. Rome needed women, so Romulus orchestrated what became known as the rape of the Sabine women, inviting the neighboring Sabines to a festival, then abducting their daughters as wives for his men. War followed as night follows day, until the Sabine women themselves, now mothers to Roman children, intervened. They stood between their fathers and their husbands, their hair streaming in the wind, their children clutched to their breasts, and begged for peace. And so 2 peoples became one. When Romulus vanished during a storm, some say taken by the gods, others whisper of darker deeds, a year passed without a king. Then came Numa Pompilius, chosen for his wisdom. Unlike his predecessor, he was a man of peace. Where Romulus had built walls, Numa built temples. Where Romulus had trained soldiers, Numa trained priests. His hands were not calloused from the sword, but smooth from handling sacred objects. Numa established the religious calendar, organized the priesthoods, and built the Temple of Janus, its doors open in war, closed in peace. During his reign of 43 gentle years, those doors remained closed. He would walk in his gardens at night, it was said, conversing with the nymph Egeria, who taught him divine wisdom by the light of the moon. The 3rd king, Tullus Hostilius, brought back the spirit of Romulus. His name, like his nature, suggested hostility. He was a warrior king who sought glory in conflict. Under him, Rome conquered Alba Longa, the city of their ancestors, incorporating its people and traditions. It was Tullus who built the first Senate house, the Curia Hostilia, its cool stone walls echoing with debates that would shape the destiny of Rome. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa, balanced the martial and the sacred. He built Rome's first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, its wooden planks creaking beneath the feet of travelers. The 5th king came not from Roman or Sabine stock, but was Etruscan. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, an immigrant from the north, brought with him Etruscan arts and engineering. He drained the Forum, transforming a marshy lowland into the beating heart of Roman civic life. He began the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and introduced the symbols of royal power, the purple toga, the ivory throne, the ceremonial parade. The streets of Rome widened under his rule. The city began to shed its rustic origins, stone replacing wood, tile replacing thatch. When an assassin's blade found him, his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, the 6th king, took the throne. Born of a slave woman, his rise was remarkable. Some said his head was surrounded by flames as a child, a sign of divine favor. Servius built Rome's first walls, encompassing all 7 hills. But his greatest innovation was social. He divided citizens into classes based on wealth rather than birth, giving voice to the plebeian class who had been without power. The city grew more prosperous. Trade flourished. The streets buzzed with languages from across the Mediterranean. In the markets, the scent of olives and wine mingled with the earthy aroma of fresh bread. But the 7th king would cast a long shadow. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, seized power by murdering Servius, his own father-in-law. His rule was iron, his methods cruel. He disregarded the Senate, executed opponents, and used forced labor to complete his building projects. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus rose on the Capitoline, its marble columns gleaming, its statues lifelike in their perfection. But it was built with suffering. When his son, Sextus Tarquinius, violated Lucretia, the wife of his cousin, she took her own life rather than live with the shame. Before dying, she called on her father and husband to avenge her. Lucius Junius Brutus, a nephew of the king who had feigned stupidity to survive, his name Brutus meaning dullard, led the uprising. As Lucretia's blood dried on the dagger she had plunged into her heart, he swore that Rome would never again be ruled by kings. The people rose up like a storm tide. Tarquin was away at war. When he returned, he found the gates closed against him, his name a curse on Roman lips. The year was 509 BCE. The kings were gone, forever. And in their place would rise something unprecedented, the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic emerged like a hesitant dawn, its light gradually spreading across the Italian peninsula. What the Romans created was bold, unprecedented, a government without a king, where power was shared and limited by law. In place of a single ruler, 2 consuls would govern, each able to veto the other, each serving for just 1 year. Below them sat the Senate, hundreds of men from noble families, their togas white with the purple stripe of their rank, their voices rising and falling in debate beneath the wooden roof of the Curia. The transition was not smooth. The exiled Tarquin sought allies among neighboring Latin cities. War followed. At the Battle of Lake Regillus, a close and bloody affair, Rome prevailed, though many lives were lost. It was said that the divine twins, Castor and Pollux, appeared during the battle, fighting for Rome, their white horses gleaming amid the chaos. In the aftermath, the fledgling republic faced a new challenge, the struggle between patricians, the aristocratic elite, and plebeians, the common citizens who formed the backbone of the army. This conflict played out in the dusty streets and open fields of Rome. The plebeians, oppressed by debt and denied political power, took extraordinary action in 494 BCE. They simply left. The entire plebeian class walked out of the city to the Sacred Mount, leaving Rome without its laborers, its craftsmen, and much of its army. The patricians, realizing their city could not function, negotiated. From this first secession came the office of the tribune of the plebs, representatives with the power to protect plebeian interests, their persons sacred and inviolable. Over the coming centuries, this struggle between classes would continue. Gradually, the plebeians gained more rights. The laws of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code, were inscribed on bronze tablets in the Forum around 450 BCE, making law public rather than a secret tool of patrician control. As Rome's internal politics evolved, so too did its relationship with its neighbors. The city faced an existential threat in 390 BCE when a Celtic tribe, the Senones, led by their chieftain Brennus, invaded Italy.
After defeating a Roman army at the river Allia, they occupied and sacked Rome itself. Only the Capitoline Hill, where citizens took refuge behind its steep slopes and strong walls, remained unconquered.
For 7 months, the Gauls occupied the city. The geese, sacred to Juno, famously gave warning when the Gauls attempted a night assault on the capital. When the Romans finally paid a ransom in gold, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales, uttering the infamous phrase, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. The Romans never forgot this humiliation. They rebuilt their city with stronger walls. They reformed their army, adopting the manipular legion that would become their signature military formation. Each maniple, a unit of 120 men, could fight independently or as part of the larger legion, giving Roman forces unprecedented flexibility on the battlefield. With this new military organization, Rome began to expand its influence. One by one, the Latin cities came under Roman control, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through conquest. By 338 BCE, the Latin League was disbanded, and most of its member cities were incorporated into the Roman state. As Rome grew, so did its confidence. Its next great challenge would come from the Samnites, a confederation of fierce mountain peoples from central Italy. 3 brutal wars spanned more than half a century. In the mountains and valleys of Samnium, Roman blood soaked the soil.
At the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, an entire Roman army was trapped and forced to surrender, walking under a yoke of spears in the ultimate humiliation. But Rome persevered. By 290 BCE, the Samnites had been subjugated, and Rome controlled most of central Italy. To the north lay the sophisticated Etruscan civilization, whose influence on Roman culture was already profound. Their cities gradually fell under Roman dominion. To the south were the wealthy Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, with their philosophers, artists, and luxurious lifestyles. When the Greek city of Tarentum attacked Roman ships in 282 BCE, it triggered a war. This would bring Rome into conflict with one of history's greatest generals, Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus came to Italy with 25,000 men and 20 war elephants, beasts the Romans had never encountered. At Heraclea and Asculum, Pyrrhus won victories, but at such cost that he allegedly remarked, "Another such victory and I am undone," giving us the term Pyrrhic victory. By 275 BCE, exhausted by his costly wins, Pyrrhus returned to Greece. Rome subjugated Tarentum, and the rest of southern Italy followed. For the first time in its history, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po Valley. Its population swelled, its resources multiplied, its army grew ever stronger. But across the Mediterranean, another power watched with concern. Carthage, the maritime empire whose purple-sailed ships dominated the western seas. A collision was inevitable. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE, not from grand strategy or ancient hatred, but from a local dispute in Sicily. The city of Messana was caught between Carthaginian influence and the expanding Greek city of Syracuse. The Mamertines, mercenaries who controlled Messana, appealed to Rome for protection. The Senate debated long and hard. Sicily lay beyond Italy. Intervention would mean challenging Carthage, a naval power without equal. Yet the strategic importance of Sicily, sitting like a stepping stone between Italy and Africa, controlling the narrow waist of the Mediterranean, was undeniable. Rome decided to intervene, crossing the narrow strait between Italy and Sicily. What followed was not the swift campaign they had hoped for, but 23 years of grueling warfare. The Carthaginians, led initially by Hanno the Great, were masters of the sea. Their quinqueremes, warships with 5 banks of oars, were faster and more maneuverable than anything Rome possessed. Their crews were experienced sailors, born to the rhythm of waves and wind.
The Romans, by contrast, were landlubbers. But they were nothing if not adaptable.
Finding a beached Carthaginian ship, they reverse-engineered it, building a fleet of their own. To compensate for their lack of naval expertise, they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that locked the ships together, turning naval battles into infantry engagements where Roman soldiers could leverage their superior close combat skills. The war ebbed and flowed. Cities changed hands. Fleets were built and destroyed. At Mylae in 260 BCE, the Roman fleet under Gaius Duilius achieved its first naval victory using the corvus. In 256 BCE, Rome launched an invasion of Africa itself, the first time its legions had ventured beyond Italy and its immediate islands. Under Marcus Atilius Regulus, the Romans won initial victories on African soil, but Carthage hired Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary general. He reorganized the Carthaginian forces and crushed the Roman expedition. Regulus was captured, and according to legend, was later sent to Rome to negotiate peace, only to advise the Senate against the Carthaginian terms before voluntarily returning to Carthage and torture. The war dragged on. Both sides exhausted their treasuries. At sea, storms sometimes claimed more ships than enemy action. In 249 BCE, Rome lost an entire fleet to a tempest off Sicily. The decisive moment came in 241 BCE. A new Roman fleet, built with private donations after the state treasury was depleted, engaged the Carthaginian fleet at the Agates Islands. Under Gaius Lutatius Catullus, the Romans won a decisive victory. Carthage sued for peace. They surrendered Sicily to Rome, agreed to pay a massive indemnity, and released all prisoners. Rome had won its first overseas territory, the province of Sicily, with its fertile wheat fields that would help feed the growing republic. But the peace was never meant to last. In the interval between wars, both powers sought to strengthen their positions. Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica from a weakened Carthage, adding further to their grievances. Carthage, meanwhile, expanded its holdings in Spain under the capable leadership of Hamilcar Barca, who brought his young son Hannibal with him, making the boy swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome. That boy would grow to be Rome's greatest nightmare. The Second Punic War erupted in 218 BCE, when Hannibal, now commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain, attacked the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. War was declared. What followed was 16 years of existential struggle, the greatest challenge Rome had ever faced. Rather than waiting for a Roman invasion of Africa or Spain, Hannibal took the war to Italy in a move of breathtaking audacity. With an army of 40,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, he marched from Spain, through southern Gaul, and across the Alps in early winter. The crossing was brutal. Men and animals died from cold, falls, and attacks by local tribes. By the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, his army was reduced by almost half. Yet what remained was a hardened force, absolutely loyal to its brilliant commander. Rome sent an army north under Publius Cornelius Scipio to stop him, but Hannibal crushed the Romans at the Ticinus and Trebia rivers. The following spring, he marched into central Italy, ambushing and destroying another Roman army at Lake Trasimene, one of the most successful ambushes in military history. Panic gripped Rome. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, an emergency position with absolute power. Fabius adopted a strategy of delay, refusing to engage Hannibal directly, earning the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. But Roman patience wore thin. In 216 BCE, the Republic fielded the largest army in its history, over 80,000 men under consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They confronted Hannibal at Cannae in southeast Italy. What followed was Rome's darkest day. Hannibal, with his numerically inferior force, executed a double envelopment, a pincer movement that surrounded and crushed the Roman army. Over 50,000 Romans died in a single day. The carnage was so great that Hannibal collected gold rings from the fingers of fallen Roman knights, sending bushels of them to Carthage as testament to his victory. Rome seemed finished. Yet, in its most desperate hour, the Republic found its greatest strength. New legions were raised. Boys too young and men too old took up arms. The wealth of private citizens was donated to the state. Rome would not surrender. Hannibal, for all his genius, lacked the siege equipment to take Rome itself. He sought to break the confederation of Italian allies that formed the foundation of Roman power, telling them he came not to conquer Italy, but to liberate it from Rome. Some cities did defect, notably Capua in Campania, but many, especially the Latin colonies, remained loyal. Without the massive reinforcements he needed from Carthage, Hannibal was forced to campaign endlessly through Italy, winning battles but unable to win the war. Meanwhile, Rome adopted a new strategy. Rather than concentrating solely on Hannibal, they attacked Carthaginian interests elsewhere. In Spain, a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio won victory after victory, eventually driving the Carthaginians from the Iberian Peninsula. By 204 BCE, Scipio, now dubbed Africanus, was ready to strike at Carthage itself. He landed in Africa with a Roman army, forcing the Carthaginians to recall Hannibal from Italy. The two greatest generals of the age finally met at Zama in 202 BCE. This time, it was Scipio who emerged victorious. His cavalry routed Hannibal's, returning to encircle the Carthaginian infantry in a reverse of Cannae. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. They surrendered Spain, their war fleet, their elephants, and agreed to pay a crushing indemnity. Most importantly, they could no longer wage war without Roman permission. The Second Punic War transformed Rome. From an Italian power with overseas interests, it had become the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean. Its confidence, though shaken, had ultimately been reinforced by survival. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 BCE, was less a war than an execution. Carthage, adhering to its treaty obligations, had endured 50 years of peace. But it had also recovered economically, arousing suspicion and envy in Rome. Marcus Porcius Cato, an influential senator, ended every speech, regardless of topic, with the phrase "Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum." Moreover, I believe Carthage must be destroyed. When Carthage defended itself against Numidian aggression without Roman permission, Rome declared war. The outcome was never in doubt. After a 3-year siege, Scipio Aemilianus took the city in 146 BCE. What followed was annihilation. Carthage was systematically destroyed, its buildings pulled down, its soil allegedly sown with salt. The surviving population was sold into slavery. Where the great Phoenician city had stood for 7 centuries, a silence fell. Rome's greatest rival was no more. With Carthage vanquished, Rome's power extended unchallenged across the Western Mediterranean. The Republic had become an empire in all but name, controlling Spain, North Africa, Greece, Macedonia, and large portions of Asia Minor. Wealth flowed into Italy from these conquered territories: grain, gold, slaves, art treasures. Yet this success carried within it the seeds of crisis. The traditional Roman character, austere, dutiful, devoted to family and state, began to erode under the influence of foreign luxuries and ideas. The gulf between rich and poor widened. Small farmers, once the backbone of the Roman army, found themselves unable to compete with large estates worked by slaves captured in foreign wars. Many sold their land and drifted to Rome, creating an urban proletariat dependent on state-subsidized grain. The army, gradually transitioning from a citizen militia to a professional force, increasingly gave its loyalty to successful generals rather than to the Republic itself. Into this volatile situation stepped 2 brothers, the Gracchi. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were aristocrats who recognized the dangers facing the Republic and sought reform. In 133 BCE, Tiberius, as tribune of the plebs, proposed redistributing public land to the poor. His methods broke with political norms, and his enemies whispered that he sought to make himself king. A mob of senators, led by his own cousin, beat him to death along with 300 of his supporters. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius took up the cause, proposing an even broader program of reforms.
For a time, he dominated Roman politics, but ultimately met the same fate as his brother, death at the hands of his opponents. The Gracchi had failed, but they had set a dangerous precedent: political violence as a tool of policy. The next generation saw the rise of Gaius Marius, a new man from outside the traditional nobility, who was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times. A brilliant military reformer, Marius opened the legions to the poor who owned no property, creating a professional army loyal to its commanders rather than to the state. When Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones, threatened Italy, Marius saved the Republic with decisive victories. But his political rivalry with Lucius Cornelius Sulla would lead to the first full-scale civil wars. Sulla, an aristocrat of ancient lineage but little wealth, rose through military success. When the Senate awarded him command of a war against Mithridates VI of Pontus in 88 BCE, Marius used his influence to have the command transferred to himself. Sulla responded by marching his legions on Rome, the first time a Roman commander had turned his arms against the city itself. After securing his command, Sulla left for the east. In his absence, Marius and his ally Lucius Cornelius Cinna took control of Rome. A bloody purge of their political enemies followed. But Marius, now an old and possibly unstable man, died shortly after taking power. When Sulla returned victorious in 83 BCE, civil war erupted again. This time, Sulla emerged triumphant. Named dictator with no time limit, an office meant for emergencies only, he instituted his own purges. Thousands died in these prescriptions, their property confiscated, their names erased from public memory. Sulla then implemented constitutional reforms aimed at strengthening the Senate's authority before surprisingly retiring to private life. He died in 78 BCE, but the republic he had sought to preserve was fundamentally weakened. The next decades saw the rise of 3 men who would transform Rome forever: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Pompey earned the epithet Magnus, the Great, through his military successes against the remnants of Marius's faction, pirates in the Mediterranean and Mithridates in the east. By his mid-30s, he had celebrated 3 triumphs and extended Roman power to the Euphrates River. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had crushed the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. Though lacking Pompey's military genius, his financial resources gave him enormous political influence. Caesar, younger than both, was a patrician from an ancient but no longer prominent family. Brilliant, charismatic, deeply in debt from political campaigns, he sought military commands that would bring both glory and wealth. In 60 BCE, these 3 men formed an unofficial alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Combining Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's wealth, and Caesar's political skills, they dominated Roman politics. Caesar secured a 5-year governorship of Gaul, where he embarked on a campaign of conquest that would add vast territories to the Republic. His Commentaries on the Gallic War, written as dispatches to Rome, ensured his military genius was recognized by the public. The alliance began to fracture with the death of Crassus, killed in battle against the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BCE. Without his moderating influence, Pompey and Caesar drifted into rivalry. As Caesar's governorship neared its end, his enemies in the Senate, allied with Pompey, sought to prosecute him once he lost the immunity of office. Caesar refused to disband his army unless Pompey did the same.
On January 10, 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary of his province, with a single legion, effectively declaring war on the Republic. Alea iacta est, he reportedly said, the die is cast. Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece to raise an army. Caesar quickly secured Italy and Spain before following them east. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar's smaller but more experienced army defeated Pompey's forces. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young King Ptolemy XIII. But the king's advisors, hoping to curry favor with Caesar, had Pompey assassinated as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he became involved in a dynastic dispute between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra VII. Caesar sided with Cleopatra, who would later bear him a son. After settling affairs in Egypt, Caesar moved against the remaining Republican forces, defeating them at Thapsus in North Africa and Munda in Spain. By 45 BCE, he was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, in February 44 BCE, Caesar embarked on an ambitious program of reforms. He reorganized the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar still used with modifications today, extended citizenship, founded colonies for veterans, and planned grand building projects. But his power alarmed many senators, who feared he intended to make himself king. On March 15th, the Ides of March, 44 BCE, a group of conspirators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, assassinated Caesar during a Senate meeting, stabbing him 23 times. They proclaimed they had liberated the Republic, but the Republic they sought to save no longer existed in anything but name. In the chaotic aftermath, 3 men emerged to avenge Caesar: Marcus Antonius, his close friend and deputy; Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, his loyal cavalry commander; and his grandnephew, adopted son, Gaius Octavius, renamed Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian. These 3 formed the Second Triumvirate, given official power by the Senate to restore order. Their first act was a series of proscriptions even bloodier than Sulla's, targeting not only political opponents but also the wealthy whose property could fund their armies. Among the victims was Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, who had spoken against Antony. His hands and head were displayed in the Forum, a grim symbol of the Republic's terminal illness. The triumvirs then turned against Caesar's assassins, defeating Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE. With their external enemies vanquished, the triumvirate itself began to fracture. Lepidus was marginalized first, eventually confined to the ceremonial position of Pontifex Maximus. The Roman world was effectively divided between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Antony became increasingly identified with Egypt and his lover Cleopatra. His adoption of Eastern customs and rumors that he planned to move the capital to Alexandria alienated Roman opinion. Octavian in Rome presented himself as the defender of traditional Roman values against Antony's Oriental excesses. When Antony divorced Octavian's sister Octavia to marry Cleopatra, the final breach occurred. In 32 BCE, the Senate declared war, not on Antony technically, but on Cleopatra. The decisive confrontation came at Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet under Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled to Egypt, where, as Octavian's forces closed in, they committed suicide. Antony by sword, Cleopatra, according to legend, by the bite of an asp. Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. The civil wars that had torn the Republic apart for a century were finally over, but so too was the Republic itself. In the aftermath of Actium, Octavian stood alone atop the Roman world. Unlike Caesar, he understood that the appearance of constitutional legitimacy was crucial. He would need to preserve the forms of the Republic while fundamentally altering its substance. In 27 BCE, in a carefully choreographed display of humility, Octavian announced to the Senate that he was relinquishing his extraordinary powers and restoring the Republic. The senators, many hand-picked by Octavian himself, begged him to reconsider. A compromise was reached. He would retain certain provinces and powers for the good of the state. The Senate bestowed upon him the name Augustus, the Revered One, a title with religious connotations that elevated him above ordinary men without explicitly making him a king. He was also given the title Princeps, First Citizen, suggesting he was merely first among equals. Thus began what historians called the Principate, the first phase of the Roman Empire, in which the fiction of the Republic was maintained even as power concentrated in the hands of one man. Augustus proved a master of this delicate balance. He lived modestly in a simple house, wore the plain toga of a senator rather than royal purple. Yet there was no doubt where ultimate authority lay. He controlled the most important provinces, including those with significant military forces. He was granted tribunician power, the sacrosanct authority of the tribunes without actually holding the office. He became Pontifex Maximus, head of the state religion. And, most importantly, he commanded the personal loyalty of the legions, who saw him as Caesar's heir and their patron. Augustus's reign brought something Romans had almost forgotten: peace. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, that would characterize the empire for 2 centuries, began with him. The doors of the Temple of Janus, open during wartime, were closed 3 times during his rule.
Under his guiding hand, Rome was transformed. "I found a city of brick and left a city of marble," he would later boast. The Forum Augustum rose with its temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. The Pantheon's first incarnation was completed. Theaters, porticos, and aqueducts brought beauty and convenience to urban life. Literature flourished in what would later be called the Augustan Age. Virgil composed the Aeneid, linking Rome's origins to the ancient heroes of Troy and providing Augustus with a divine mandate. Horace wrote odes celebrating traditional Roman virtues. Livy chronicled Rome's history, emphasizing its moral foundations. Augustus also sought to restore traditional family values, passing legislation to encourage marriage and childbearing among the upper classes. He exiled his own daughter, Julia, for her scandalous behavior, showing that no one was above his moral reforms. Under his guiding hand, Rome was transformed. "I found a city of brick and left a city of marble," he would later boast. The Forum Augustum rose with its temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. The Pantheon's first incarnation was completed. Theaters, porticos, and aqueducts brought beauty and convenience to urban life. Literature flourished in what would later be called the Augustan Age. Virgil composed the Aeneid, linking Rome's origins to the ancient heroes of Troy and providing Augustus with a divine mandate. Horace wrote odes celebrating traditional Roman virtues. Livy chronicled Rome's history, emphasizing its moral foundations. Augustus also sought to restore traditional family values, passing legislation to encourage marriage and childbearing among the upper classes. He exiled his own daughter, Julia, for her scandalous behavior, showing that no one was above his moral reforms.
Rome mourned its first emperor, who was promptly deified by the Senate. Tiberius, already in his 50s when he came to power, had been a brilliant general in his youth. As emperor, he initially followed Augustus's policies with careful attention to the Senate's dignity. But as years passed, he grew increasingly reclusive and suspicious. In 26 CE, he retired to the island of Capri, leaving Rome in the hands of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus began eliminating potential rivals, including members of the imperial family. Only in 31 CE did Tiberius finally recognize the threat, ordering Sejanus's execution. The final years of Tiberius's reign were marked by treason trials and purges. When he died in 37 CE, Rome greeted his successor with relief. That successor was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, Little Boot. The son of the beloved general Germanicus, Caligula was initially popular. But after a serious illness early in his reign, possibly encephalitis, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He declared himself a living god, appointed his horse as consul, or threatened to, executed citizens for their wealth, and allegedly committed incest with his sisters. Whether these accounts are accurate or later exaggerations by hostile historians, his reign was cut short after just 4 years when he was assassinated by officers of the Praetorian Guard. In the chaos following Caligula's death, the Praetorians found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and proclaimed him emperor, essentially creating an imperial dynasty by force. Despite his physical disabilities, he limped, stuttered, and drooled when excited, leading many to underestimate his intelligence. Claudius proved an able administrator. Under his rule, Britain was conquered and incorporated into the empire. The civil service expanded, and public works flourished. Claudius's personal life was less successful. His third wife, Messalina, notorious for her infidelity, was executed after openly celebrating a bigamous marriage while the emperor was away from Rome. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, his own niece, dominated the latter part of his reign and likely poisoned him in 54 CE to secure the succession of her son, Nero. Nero came to the throne at 16, initially guided by his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. These early years were marked by good government. But as Nero grew more confident, his artistic pretensions and personal excesses came to the fore. In 59 CE, he had his mother Agrippina murdered after several failed attempts. When fire devastated Rome in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero had sung of the destruction of Troy while watching the flames. To divert suspicion, he blamed the Christians, beginning the first imperial persecution of the new religion. Nero's extravagance, particularly his golden house, an enormous palace complex in the heart of Rome, drained the treasury. As opposition grew, he responded with executions and forced suicides, claiming victims including Seneca, the poet Lucan, and many senators. When Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, rebelled in 68 CE, other provinces quickly followed. The Praetorian Guard abandoned Nero, and the Senate declared him a public enemy. Facing execution, Nero fled Rome and committed suicide, allegedly uttering the words, "What an artist dies in me." His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus. What followed was the Year of the Four Emperors, a brief but intense civil war that exposed a dangerous secret. Emperors could be made elsewhere than Rome, and the legions had the power to elevate their commanders to the purple. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius rose and fell in quick succession. Finally, Vespasian, commander of the Eastern legions, emerged victorious, establishing the Flavian dynasty. A man of humble origins with a practical nature, Vespasian restored stability and financial discipline to the empire. He began construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum, on the site of Nero's hated Golden House, a powerful symbolic gesture, returning to the people land that his predecessor had appropriated. When Vespasian died of natural causes in 79 CE, reportedly joking with his last breath, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god," he was succeeded by his son Titus, who had led the Roman forces during the Jewish War, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Titus's brief reign was marked by disasters: the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, a fire in Rome, and a devastating plague. Yet his generous response to these calamities made him beloved. When he died after just 2 years as emperor, Romans mourned him as the delight of mankind. His younger brother, Domitian, succeeded him, ruling for 15 years with increasing authoritarianism. Though an able administrator who strengthened the northern frontiers, his relationships with the Senate deteriorated as he demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. In 96 CE, he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy. The Senate then took an unprecedented step, selecting one of their own, the elderly Nerva, as emperor. This began what historians would later call the Five Good Emperors period, where succession was determined not by heredity but by adoption of the most qualified candidate. Nerva, facing opposition from the Praetorian Guard, adopted the popular general Trajan as his heir. When Nerva died in 98 CE, the transition was seamless. Trajan, born in Spain, was the first emperor from the provinces rather than Italy. A soldier, he expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia, modern Romania, for its gold mines and briefly extending Roman rule into Mesopotamia. Yet he was also a builder and administrator. His forum in Rome was the largest and most magnificent. His extensive program of public works included roads, bridges, aqueducts, and harbors. His correspondence with Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, reveals a ruler concerned with details of provincial administration and justice. When Trajan died in 117 CE, his cousin and adopted heir Hadrian succeeded him. Where Trajan had been expansionist, Hadrian recognized the empire's limits. He abandoned the most eastern conquests and focused on consolidation rather than expansion. Hadrian is perhaps best remembered for the Great Wall in Britain that bears his name, a massive stone barrier stretching across the island's narrow waist, marking the empire's northwestern frontier. But he was also a Philhellene who rejuvenated Athens and traveled extensively throughout his domains, personally inspecting troops and checking provincial administration. His artistic sensibilities found expression in his villa at Tibur, modern Tivoli, a sprawling complex that recreated famous buildings and places from throughout the empire. He even founded a new religion around his beloved Antinomus, a young Greek who drowned in the Nile. Hadrian's chosen successor, Antoninus Pius, ruled for 23 peaceful years, earning his epithet, Pius, for his dutiful behavior to his adoptive father. His reign represents perhaps the high watermark of imperial stability and good government. Upon Antoninus's death in 161 CE, the empire passed to his adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, who chose to share power with his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus. When Verus died in 169 CE, Marcus ruled alone until his own death in 180 CE. Marcus Aurelius faced more challenges than his immediate predecessors: wars on the northern frontiers against German tribes, a conflict with Parthia in the east, and a devastating plague, possibly smallpox, brought back by returning troops. Despite these pressures, Marcus is remembered less as a warrior than as a philosopher. Meditations, written during campaign nights in his tent, reveal a thoughtful ruler steeped in Stoic philosophy, striving to live virtuously in a challenging world. Marcus made one crucial departure from the practice of his predecessors. Rather than adopting the most qualified successor, he allowed his biological son, Commodus, to succeed him. It was a decision that would end the Pax Romana and begin a new, more troubled era in Roman history. Commodus, who had co-ruled with his father during the final years of Marcus Aurelius's reign, quickly revealed himself to be unsuited for imperial responsibilities. Handsome and athletic, he preferred the gladiatorial arena to the Senate House. He fought in the arena hundreds of times, though opponents would always yield to the emperor. He styled himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, posing for statues in the demigod's lion skin with club in hand. As his behavior grew more erratic, he renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, Commodian colony, and renamed all the months of the year after his various titles. His megalomaniacal tendencies were matched by his paranoia. Purges and executions became common. On the last day of 1920 CE, a conspiracy involving his concubine Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus finally succeeded in assassinating him, first attempting poison, then sending in a wrestler to strangle him. What followed was another period of civil war, as 5 different men claimed the purple in less than 2 years. Ultimately, Septimius Severus, commander of the Pannonian legions, emerged victorious, founding the Severan dynasty. A North African by birth, Severus was a capable soldier who secured the empire's frontiers and increased the army's pay and privileges. He told his sons on his deathbed to enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, advice that revealed the changing nature of imperial power, which now rested firmly on military support rather than constitutional fiction. His son Caracalla, who murdered his own brother Geta to rule alone, is best remembered for the Constitutio Antoniniana, which granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free men within the empire. This was less an act of enlightened policy than a way to expand the tax base, as citizens paid certain taxes that non-citizens didn't. After Caracalla's assassination in 217 CE, the Severan dynasty continued through increasingly unlikely means. His cousin Elagabalus, a teenage priest of a Syrian sun god, scandalized Rome with his religious practices and alleged sexual excesses before being killed by the Praetorian Guard. Alexander Severus, another cousin, ruled for 13 years under the influence of his mother Julia Mamaea, bringing a measure of stability. But when he attempted to negotiate with rather than fight German tribes, his troops mutinied and murdered both him and his mother in 235 CE. This marked the beginning of the 3rd century crisis, a 50-year period of unprecedented instability. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 men claimed the title of emperor, most ruling for only a few years or even months before being overthrown. External pressures mounted as well. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire had replaced the Parthians as Rome's main rival and was more aggressive than its predecessor. In the north, Germanic tribes, pushed westward by movements of peoples from the Asian steppes, pressed against the imperial frontiers. The empire briefly fractured into 3 parts: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyran Empire in the east, and a rump Roman state in the middle. Economic problems multiplied as currency was debased to pay the armies, leading to rampant inflation. A devastating plague, known as the Plague of Cyprian, further weakened the empire. It seemed Rome might finally collapse. But from the chaos emerged a series of soldier emperors who gradually restored order. Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 CE, earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, by defeating the breakaway Gallic and Palmyrene empires and reuniting the Roman world. He built new walls around Rome, the Aurelian walls that still partially stand today, a tacit admission that Italy itself was no longer secure from invasion. After several more short-lived emperors, Diocletian, a Dalmatian of humble birth who had risen through the military ranks, seized power in 284 CE. His 21-year reign would transform the empire. Recognizing that the empire had grown too large for one man to govern effectively, Diocletian established the Tetrarchy, rule by 4. He appointed a co-Augustus, Maximian, to rule the western half of the empire, while he took the east. Each Augustus then adopted a Caesar as junior emperor and heir. This division acknowledged the reality that different parts of the empire faced different challenges. The East was wealthier, more urbanized, Greek-speaking, and threatened primarily by Persia. The West was more rural, Latin-speaking, and faced the growing pressure of Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube. Diocletian also reorganized the provinces, roughly doubling their number while grouping them into larger administrative units called dioceses. He separated civilian from military authority to reduce the risk of rebellion, and expanded the imperial bureaucracy. His economic reforms were less successful. His edict on maximum prices, attempting to control inflation by government decree, was widely ignored and ultimately abandoned. In religious matters, Diocletian initially showed little interest in persecuting Christians who had grown significantly in numbers. But in the later years of his reign, perhaps influenced by his Caesar Galerius, he launched the Great Persecution, the most systematic attempt to suppress Christianity until that time. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something almost unprecedented. He voluntarily abdicated, compelling his co-Augustus Maximian to do the same. He retired to his massive palace in Split, in modern Croatia, where he reportedly found contentment growing cabbages. But his carefully designed succession plan quickly unraveled. The sons of the former Augusti felt cheated of their inheritance. Civil war erupted once again. From this chaos emerged Constantine, son of the Caesar Constantius Chlorus. After defeating a series of rivals, most notably Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine emerged as sole ruler of the West by 313 CE, and eventually the entire empire by 324 CE. According to tradition, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, and the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields, and his victory convinced him of the Christian God's power. In 313 CE, Constantine and his then ally Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to all faiths, including Christianity. But it was clear where Constantine's own sympathies lay. He lavished funds on Christian churches, granted the clergy special privileges, and convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to resolve doctrinal disputes. Though Constantine himself delayed baptism until his deathbed, a common practice at the time, his reign marked the beginning of Rome's transformation into a Christian empire. Equally significant was his founding of a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of the Greek city of Byzantium. Located on the Bosporus, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, it occupied a strategic position commanding the passage between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Constantine's choice recognized the growing economic and strategic importance of the eastern provinces. It would prove prescient, as Constantinople would remain the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen. Constantine died in 337 CE, having fundamentally altered the empire's trajectory. The absolutist tendencies that had been growing since Diocletian were now entrenched. The emperor was no longer merely the first citizen, but dominus, lord and master, surrounded by elaborate court ceremonial that emphasized his separation from ordinary mortals. After Constantine's death, the empire was divided among his 3 sons, who soon fell to fighting amongst themselves. Once again, civil war loomed. But the dynasty endured through his nephew, Julian, called the Apostate by Christian writers for his attempt to revive paganism, and then Jovian, a short-lived Christian emperor. In 364 CE, the army elevated Valentinian I, who immediately appointed his brother Valens as co-emperor. Valens took the west, Valens the east, formalizing a division that would become permanent. As the 4th century progressed, pressures on the imperial frontiers intensified. A nomadic people from Central Asia, the Huns, began moving westward, pushing Germanic tribes ahead of them like a wave. In 376 CE, one such tribe, the Goths, appeared on the Danube frontier seeking asylum within the empire. Emperor Valens permitted them to cross, but corrupt Roman officials mistreated the refugees, provoking a rebellion. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, the Goths annihilated a Roman army, killing Valens himself. It was a shocking defeat that showed how vulnerable the empire had become. Valens's successor in the east, Theodosius I, managed to pacify the Goths temporarily by settling them as foederati, allies with military obligations within imperial territory. When Theodosius became sole ruler of the reunited empire in 392 CE, it seemed unity might be restored. But upon his death in 395 CE, the empire was permanently divided between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. They would never rule together, and the two halves of the empire began to drift apart. The Western Empire's position was particularly precarious. Its tax base was smaller, its cities less prosperous, its frontiers more threatened. Increasingly, it relied on Germanic foederati to supplement its armies, creating a dangerous dependency. The most powerful of these foederati were the Visigoths under their leader Alaric. When the Western government failed to honor agreements made with them, Alaric led his people into Italy itself. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. Rome, the eternal city, was sacked by Alaric's forces. Though the Visigoths only remained for 3 days and were relatively restrained in their looting, the psychological impact was enormous. Saint Jerome in distant Bethlehem wrote, "The city which had conquered the world was itself conquered." In the aftermath, the Western Empire continued to lose territory. Britain was abandoned around 410 CE. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, conquering Rome's richest remaining province by 439 CE. The Visigoths established a kingdom in southern Gaul and Spain. For a time, capable generals like Flavius Aetius, called the last of the Romans, held the fragmenting empire together through a combination of military skill and diplomacy. Aetius's crowning achievement was the defeat of Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 CE, where Roman forces fought alongside Visigothic allies against the Hunnic threat. But the Western imperial court, now based in Ravenna rather than Rome for better security, was plagued by infighting and intrigue. Valentinian III, the weak emperor who had relied on Aetius, murdered his general with his own hand in 454 CE, only to be assassinated himself the following year. What followed was a rapid succession of puppet emperors controlled by powerful generals, many of Germanic origin. Real power increasingly lay with these military leaders rather than with the emperors they installed and removed at will. In 476 CE, the German warlord Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, the teenage Romulus Augustulus. Instead of appointing a replacement, Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor Zeno, declaring that one emperor was sufficient for the empire. Odoacer ruled Italy as king, nominally acknowledging the sovereignty of the emperor in Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a quiet political accommodation that merely recognized existing realities. The eastern half of the empire, what historians would later call the Byzantine Empire, though its citizens continued to call themselves Romans, would survive for nearly 1,000 years more. Every time we use a calendar with 12 months, drive on an expertly engineered road, or live under a government with checks and balances, we touch the legacy of Rome. But perhaps Rome's greatest achievement was the idea of Rome itself, the concept of a universal civilization bound not by ethnicity or religion, but by law, citizenship, and shared values. Though the empire often fell short of its ideals, those ideals themselves, order, justice, stability, and prosperity, remain powerful. In the words of the historian Thomas Cahill, the glory that was Rome, the grandeur that was Rome, these were never idle phrases. They were the literal truth. And so, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep, remember that you too are an heir of Rome. The eternal city lives on in the contours of our world, in the language we speak, in the laws we follow, in the very buildings that shelter us. The Roman eagle may have fallen, but its memory soars still. Sleep now. Sleep in the gentle embrace of history. Sleep with the whispers of ancient Rome as your lullaby. Good night.
Its language became the mother of Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Even languages that did not descend directly from Latin, like English, borrowed heavily from its vocabulary. Its legal system formed the foundation of civil law used throughout much of the world today. Concepts like presumption of innocence, equality before the law, and professional judges all have Roman roots. Its architectural innovations, the arch, the dome, concrete, made possible buildings that still stand 2 millennia later. From St. Peter's Basilica to the United States Capitol, public buildings around the world echo Roman forms. Its literature established genres and themes that writers still explore. Virgil's epic journey, Ovid's transformations, Cicero's rhetoric, Seneca's essays all continue to be read and studied. Its practical achievements, roads that connected distant lands, aqueducts that brought fresh water to crowded cities, a postal system that facilitated communication across continents, demonstrated what human ingenuity could accomplish.
Under Justinian I, 527 to 565 CE, it would briefly reconquer much of the Western Mediterranean, including Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. But these conquests proved ephemeral. The rise of Islam in the 7th century led to the loss of Egypt, Syria, and eventually North Africa. The Slavic migrations transformed the Balkans. By the medieval period, the Byzantine Empire had become primarily a Greek state, centered on Constantinople and Anatolia. In the West, the Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman rule gradually evolved into the medieval states of Europe. The Roman Catholic Church preserved much of Roman administrative structure and law. The Latin language, though evolving into the Romance family of languages, remained the language of learning, diplomacy, and religion. Rome never truly died. Like water seeping into soil, it nourished what came after.